you thought that Yankees talked fast. Anyway, I want to thank you for that introduction, and I want to pay honor and respect to the former mayor of Pensacola. We served together from 1988 to 1991, and I like Pensacola quite a bit, and I had 2 tours of it today, and I got here about 11 o'clock, and I feel like I've been here for quite a while. And, I mean in the good sense, you know what I mean? So there are many things that we could discuss and talk about, and I'll try to leave those for the question and answer period. But I did want to focus on one thing for the first part of this program, and that is the issue of design and why things have happened in cities and some of the things that we can do to improve them. The slide that you see up there now is the logo for the 12th Congress of the Congress for New Urbanism, which is in Chicago, June 24 to 27. You're all welcome to come to it if you want to. You pick up a lot of ideas about design. The CNU is an organization of architects, engineers, developers, real estate brokers, con artists, you know, all kinds of people. Anybody that's interested in building up cities. And I think if you're really interested in picking up a lot of useful information, it's worth the trip. Next year we're in Pasadena, if you want to wait till then. Anyway, let's just get right into it. This is the sprawl development that we're very familiar with on the edges of America's metropolitan areas. And I just want to make a point here that this is a product not of the free market alone. It's a product of very intrusive actions by the government. And that intrusive action is separate use zoning is one of the things. The other things, of course, are the designs that are used by the Department of Transportation, federal and state. But the separate use zoning, I just want to describe what that is. It's basically the ingredients of the city separated out over the landscape. So you have, if you take the old parts of the city where you had the retail on the first floor with the apartments above, you have all the different ingredients of the city together. And then with sprawl, they're separated into different pods. Retail in one spot, office in another, the housing separated into pods depending on price. Everything's out over the landscape. And the opposite of it, urban development, is also the product of government interference and the market, a combination of both, just like sprawl. But here it's a little bit different. This is called form-based zoning by some people. And this is an old street in Milwaukee, the main street, and you can see there's quite a variety of building types. And up and down the street there's hotels and in some cases apartments. But the one thing they have in common is a common setback from the street with sidewalks, curb. I don't know, maybe we need to turn the lights down a little bit in the back maybe. So can everybody see okay? You see this? I think the lights are too bright. But anyway, both of them are the product of, is that better? Okay, we'll go back to the other one just so you can see it. This is a place called Brookfield, or Brookfield Mall. Malls are usually named after what they replaced, in this case, the brook and the field. And then this is Wisconsin Avenue. And it has just like your main street, only the buildings aren't quite as big. But you have, you know, a street with sidewalks and then the buildings, retail on the first floor, low-cost housing above that was invented before the federal government invented low-cost housing. This is Jacksonville. And Jacksonville has tried very hard to be a great city. And it will be a great city someday. In fact, you know, their promotional brochures already say it's a great city, and I don't want to get in an argument with them. But they tried very hard in the 70s and 80s, and they basically built an office park in their downtown, and a single-use office park. Everything was about offices, and then they tore down most of the stuff that was mixed use. And someday they'll fill it back in. They're very conscious of it, working. I was just there last week. So if it's not perfect, it's not because they're not trying. In fact, they tried too hard. They did too much in the 70s and 80s, and they tore down a lot of stuff that would really be valuable today, like shotgun houses, which were very stigmatized, but actually are wonderful and delightful. This is how most office space has been built over the last 50 years. You know, sure, the big cities like New York and Chicago have office space, but most of it's this, and this is sort of a really pure example of separate use zoning. And you have I mean, they definitely solved the problem of trying to figure out where you park. That's taken care of completely. But if you try some other things, some other human endeavors other than parking, like going to lunch, unless you drive, that's a real problem. Walking across those highways would not only be dangerous, but it's illegal. Now this is back to that form-based zoning or code, and you'll notice there's a parade. And one of the functions that you can't really do in sprawl is parades. It's one of the community events that just disappears in sprawl. You can't do it. You can do it in cities, you can do it in villages, you can do it in really small towns or really big towns. As long as you have a street grid and small blocks, parades work really well. When the parade is done, then people go into the street grid, and every intersection they go through, their choices grow by a factor of 3. So there's really very little congestion. This is the 350,000 person attendance circus parade in Milwaukee, and there's really no traffic jam at the beginning or the end because the variety. Now, you can't really hold a parade, excuse me, I have to go back, but we go back to this environment. It's really hard to hold a parade because the intersections are almost a mile apart, and so you would all be using the same intersection at the end. So you might have noticed that when the New York Islanders won the Stanley Cup 3 years in a row back in the early 90s, they tried to hold a parade out in Long Island and Nassau County, and they just never found a spot until finally they gave up, and they got the convertibles lined up at a mall, and they drove around in a circle around the mall. Now this is the City Hall in Milwaukee, and this was built in 1895, and it looks like it might have been expensive because it's very elaborate. The bell tower, there's actually a bell that sounds like Big Ben. You know, it's very impressive. But actually, it was the product of a very economy-minded city council. It's built on a leftover remnant piece of real estate. It's narrower on one end than the other. So it was the leftover piece. The private sector had filled up all the rest of the community with tax-paying development, and so they put it there. But then as long as they had saved so much money on the land, they spent the money on the beautiful building. And the design criteria, they had a design competition. If you can imagine, in 1891, when they started building it, they had a design competition, and they required an 8-story atrium inside. They required the bell tower, and then they had 9 entries, and somebody from out of town finished first from the citizen panel of judges, and then the council chose the local architect who had finished second to actually build it. But it works pretty well because Witold Rybczynski is one of the great architects in the world you've never heard of. Some of you have heard of him maybe. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. But he visited Milwaukee and he said it's the most beautiful city hall in the world. And I know he was telling the truth because he also insulted us over all kinds of other buildings that he didn't like, so it had to be true. This is the City Hall in Brookfield. I don't mean to pick so much on Brookfield. I actually had the courage to go out to Brookfield twice and show pictures similar to this. And, but you know, now they use lots of land for municipal buildings. There's always ornamental lawns, and then on the other side of this building, a vast parking lot. And so the Brookfield people are very sensitive about their community. They took my criticism to heart, and they put a bell tower on the building. And so it's they're on top of things. Now this is the police station in a suburb called Mequon. So you can see that the architecture was trying to establish a relationship between the people and the police department, but he didn't do very well. This is a minimalist building, and you wonder, where did minimalism come from? Well, it was part of the variety of design movements that happened after World War I in Europe. Now, there was a reason why these movements happened: the Dada movement, the Bauhaus, the international style, all the different movements. They rejected the ornament of the past, the ornamentally designed buildings of pre-World War I. And I think they did it partly because they were so depressed, and you would have been depressed too. Imagine the first machine gun war. Millions of people killed in the trenches, millions more killed right after the war by flu, a flu epidemic that killed some 18 million people in Europe. So it was a pretty depressing time. And so you had all these artists come along like Egon Schiele and so forth, and they had very minimalist style. And so, you know, when they built buildings that were brutal, the most minimalist school is the brutalist school, using concrete. When they did that, there was a reason. They understood. These were classically trained architects like Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and Gropius and so forth. And they were classic, so they understood what they were rebelling against. And so you can understand why they would have built a building like that back in the 1930s. But the architect that Mequon hired in 1988 to build this building was protesting man's inhumanity to man in Europe in World War I, and forgot to tell the local citizenry. So all they saw was this big block of concrete drop on them. And here's the City Hall in a place called Caledonia. Now this is basically a garage, and it's on a huge parcel. It's on some 27 acres of land, a huge parking lot, lots of ornamental. You could have a golf, a couple holes. It's all set up. And then there's a little room with a card table and chairs around it. And that's really what democracy in a garage. And most of the municipal architecture now is like that. Now this is the Pabst Theater, built in Milwaukee in 1895. And here's the Oriental Theater in 1926. So that's 2 theaters in Milwaukee. Here's 10 in Brookfield, the 10-plex. Now this is a hotel, 1891. This building had its 100th anniversary. And a lot of buildings survived from the 19th century, and all of them, of course, have had their 100th anniversary. And it was quite remarkable when, in 1991, when they had the party, and people from all over the world, people that had their honeymoon there, or fallen in love there, or whatever, all the different things, people, entertainers that had performed there, people, hundreds and hundreds of people came to the party. But then think of most of the hotels that are built today. This would be sort of the format. This could be in Florida, except for the snow there. And the form of it, it's not that it's set back from the street and all kinds of other things, but it has ribbon windows, which was an invention of Mies van der Rohe. And Mies van der Rohe's buildings, the ones that he did, are great. The ribbon window was a new, novel idea. But now all the hotels have ribbon windows, and it doesn't work so well. You just think about that. Now here's a building that was built in the early 1930s. It was a stock brokerage, now it's a hotel. And it was built so well that it easily transferred to another use. When you think of all the buildings that have been built in the last 35, 40 years, most of them don't transfer very well to another use. And why is that? I'll give you some answers later, but I'm just raising the questions right now. This is a church built in 1893, the Jesu Cathedral on the Marquette University campus. And here's the biggest church in the whole metropolitan area, the Elmbrook Church. I guess that little thing sticking out of the roof kind of gives you the hint that it might be a church, but otherwise it's hard to tell. This is a convention center that was actually called an exhibition hall, which I think is a better name for a convention center. The names are changed to protect the guilty. But anyway, this exhibition hall was replaced in the mid-60s by this VCR that was dropped on Milwaukee. It's a scale model, large scale model of a VCR. And here again, the architect was expressing his angst about World War I in 1965. Didn't let the people in on the secret. Now it's been replaced with this building, which isn't perfect, but it does have, it's really hard with convention centers. It's one of the most dismal areas of architecture, and there's a reason for it. There are excuses that are actually rational. I mean, basically a convention center needs to be a place where trucks can drive in and unload display material. And so they have this, they're basically truck warehouses. But in this case, there's glass around two sides of the building, and it creates an environment where people actually would want to walk. Now again, back to this question of separate use zoning and sprawl. Another additional problem with this is because the roads are the blocks are so far apart, there aren't options. There's not redundancy. There's not a matrix. There's not options. And so it loads the traffic into just a few places and then creates congestion and flooding. And we kind of learned that with the Everglades when they tried to channelize the river and the streams and so forth, that actually just pushed flooding further down and degraded the ability of the wetland to absorb water. Same thing happens with traffic. When you have just a few roads and they get bigger and bigger because the engineer says, well, it might congest, let's make it bigger. And if you do that with a river, then you have to build levees that are taller and taller, and the pressure continues to grow. It doesn't work. And that's why nature created the bayous and all the different river systems you have to deal with all these rivers that come down this way. And you can try to screw it up if you want, but it's expensive and stupid and counterproductive. And that's what happens with this kind of system. And you have a good example of a grid. All you have to do is look at your city. It's on a grid. Part of the grid was designed by the Spaniards using the West Indies plan. Now this is a complicated, complex neighborhood in Chicago. It's Wicker Park. North Avenue, Damon, and Milwaukee Avenue all collide. And this is what people were trying to clean up in the United States at the end of World War II. And that's part of what led to sprawl. You'd had 12 years of depression, 5 years of war. The buildings needed to be painted. There was a lot of maintenance problems. And everything old was bad and everything new was good. And the city was too messy. But the problem is that when they cleaned all this stuff up, and they fortunately didn't clean this neighborhood up, they left it alone, they sterilized the cities. And they sterilized them of their economy, the jobs, and spread everything out over the landscape. And now this is back in style. In fact, last year, there was only one large enclosed mall built in America. This year, probably none. And now the retail developers are doing streets and blocks. I'll show you some examples of that later. It's a little crude, but they're getting there. Because it is the complexity of the city that helps to generate wealth. It's what young people nowadays more and more want. They don't want to live in a company campus. They don't want to have their life completely controlled. They want the chaos. This Wicker Park, a neighborhood that was in trouble 25 years ago, is now a neighborhood that's doing very well. And it has hundreds of artists that are in and around this intersection. Over 1,000 within a square mile of this intersection. Now, this is a drawing by a Floridian, Andres Duani. And I just bring this to your attention. This is suburbia, two forms of suburbia. We're not talking about, the old parts of Pensacola here on the straight grid, but, curvy streets in both sections. But there's a difference. There's a suburbia that functions where you can walk for some of your behaviors. You don't have to drive every place. You can have all the cars you want, but you could your kids could walk to the neighbor's house and so forth. Or you can have this thing with every single function has its own entry into the arterial. And that's the difference between pure sprawl and what I'm talking about. You don't need to convert all of the area that has been built up over the last 40 years and somehow feel terrible about it and feel like it just can't possibly work. But actually you can have streets and blocks. They don't have to be straight lines. And you can still get around. But with sprawl you can't. You have the mall with its own entry. Apartments have their own entry. Apartments are never allowed to be near the other houses. You have the big boxes. Everything has its own entry. And the school usually on the edge of town so that the kids all drive. In this case, then there's more parking spots for the students than there are for the teachers. Whereas if you have a community that's connected with a grid, then you can walk for some of these things. Not everything has to go out into the big arterial. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a sidewalk. And a sidewalk is disappearing as each new subdivision is built without it. I'm not saying that there aren't things there. If you're in a fairly rural area, you don't have to have sidewalks. I'm not saying they're mandatory. But before we stop building them all together, I think we ought to think about what they mean. They're really important connective tissue in neighborhoods. Not everyone drives. People under the age of 16 at least shouldn't drive. It's illegal, if not dangerous. Of course, it's dangerous for those who are 16 and 17 as well, but I don't want to get into that. But anyway, so you can move through the neighborhood without walking in traffic. You can use modern technology like the razor board. You can play. It's an informal play area, and the neighbors can help watch each other's kids. And importantly now, and it's much more measurable now in this case, retail. People want to do destination shopping. Now they can't buy all of the products they need in their life at Pottery Barn. So you can't. It's not. This isn't about creating quaint streets with little boutiques, and that's the only. People actually do want to do discount shopping, and some people really depend on it. If you're not wealthy, just to balance your budget, you need to go to the discount shopping and that sort of thing. But increasingly, the discount shoppers themselves, or the stores themselves, are figuring out that if they're along a street, they can combine a feeling of destination with a feeling of also saving money. You can have it both. Now, this is an old street. This is a street that never deteriorated. It's in Toronto, Bloor Street. It's one of the main east-west streets. And it's dominated by the property owners along it. The retailers never, ever let the traffic engineers take away their parking so that the cars could go faster by their stores. The retailers knew they needed a little friction on the street so that people would occasionally stop and buy stuff. Because if you have a retail street and you don't have parking, you're not going to make money. Unless it's in a mega city like New York with Fifth Avenue, you're not going to make money. So here you have this street with my son and I there. And the parking is here. Now the retailers need that parking, and the consumer wants to know that they're going to be able to park in front of the store they go to. Now, they're not actually going to park in front of that store. That spot will be filled when they arrive, but they think it'll be there. And then once they get there, they'll park a little further down, or they'll go to that lot and back. But if the traffic engineer succeeds in stealing all these spots so that everybody can go fast, you're not going to have good retail. Now, and these streets are very valuable. Billionaires, like these 4 billionaires, 2 of them are dead, but let's forget about that for the moment. But they will hang out on an urban street. But you're not going to find billionaires hanging out in a parking lot in a strip mall. That's not what they're going to do. And they can go anywhere they want. And urban streets are what attract people who have money in their pockets. And if you don't have any money in your pockets, you want some people around like that so you can get some of their money. But this is what we do to the streets instead. You know, here's a pedestrian trying to manage his way down this street. And here's another form of it. And I want to just explain what this is. This is the most likely configuration for an arterial street in the United States of America. If there's a new area developing and you put in a big arterial street, it's most likely to be the dimensions of this street. This street has 72 feet of pavement. It has a 22-foot median, so you can do your left turn lanes. And after spending all that money on pavement, there's not enough money left over for a sidewalk. So there's this area where the household people in the household help industry get to walk along here, or they can walk in the gutter like this fellow here. Now, this didn't happen because of some free market thing that just happened. You know, it wasn't like Milton Friedman created these 72-foot streets. Here is the format for it. This is Le Corbusier, who was Swiss, but he was a French-speaking Swiss. And this is his drawing from 1922. And if you saw this closely, you'd see these cars are cars that look like 1922. And then the buildings look remarkably contemporary, steel and glass. And that's what he was doing with this drawing. He was dealing with 2 forms of technology that were relatively new, the automobile and the steel and glass buildings, so you didn't have to worry about having massive foundations, piling everything up at an angle so that it would stand up. You could just go straight up. So he did this drawing. It was a brilliant drawing. And it is not only predictive, but prescriptive. This basic drawing ended up being the format for a commercial street in the United States 30, 40 years later. And you can see a perfect example of this in Crystal City, Virginia, near the Reagan Airport. Reagan Airport if you're a Republican, National Airport if you're a Democrat. This is the Jefferson Davis Highway. And it is that drawing, almost precisely, you can see. And here's another form of it in Wauwatosa and Mayfair Road west of Milwaukee. There are grade separations here, but that's the 72-foot arterial. And here, just so you know the true ideological origins of this kind of street, because these modernists did have socialist tendencies. This is in former communist East Berlin, Karl Marx Allee. Allee means avenue in German. And this is Corbusier's form. So if they liked it, how come we like it? Anyway, this is Corbusier. And those glasses he's wearing, approximately 22% of the students at the University of Miami Architecture School have glasses exactly like that. So you know. This is Corbusier's drawing for the left bank of the Seine. If any of you have been to Paris, you know the Sorbonne is near here. Very charming. There's billions of dollars of real estate in a very small area. It's one of the very expensive place. If you wanted a 2-bedroom apartment, it would be $2 million or more. Anyway, he wanted to replace that with these towers in a park. And the towers in the park were not something the French wanted, so they rejected his idea. But one of his disciples built a good example of it right here in the United States. This is in Chicago, Robert Taylor Homes along the Dan Ryan Expressway. And even with lake views, these buildings didn't work. They concentrated poor people in these buildings with the park around the outside, which wasn't useful because the building was right in the middle of it. And it ended up failing. All these buildings are now torn down except one, and they're being replaced with lower rise, more urban buildings that look like the rest of Chicago instead of trying to look like they landed from outer space. It's a bad thing to experiment on poor people with experimental housing. It'll fail every time. If you want to experiment on kind of strange forms of housing, do it to rich people, because they're not going to have to deal with all the social consequences the way the poor did with these high-rises, which have been torn down all over the country. But the idea never goes away. It's so pure and attractive. It's so seductive. Salah Habib, the woman who just won the Pritzker Prize, this is her drawing for dormitories for the Olympics in 2012 that New York wants. This is in Long Island. Remember, that's where Archie Bunker was from? And there's all these, mid-rise, 8-story walk-up apartments and so forth. And she puts this there. And it's very elegant, except who would want to live in it when it's done? And here's another idea from a different architect. And then this from a Dutch architect. Here you have all these neighborhoods which have lasted over 100 years, gone through wave after wave of immigration, buildings reinventing themselves, getting fixed up as the decades go by. And then suddenly this brutalist, and it shows how important the architect is, but it just disrespects everything around it. So the architect's important, the buildings are important, and everything else is nothing. And that's a lot of what happened in the last 50 years, a good example. But it's happening again, because this brutalist, minimalist style is so seductive. It goes right up to the edge, right up to the cliff. And then anybody that wants to criticize it or pull back from it is considered a reactionary by the architectural critics that love this kind of stuff. But you can't live in it. That's the problem. And here's an example in Milwaukee. This is an Italian neighborhood, and then the Corbusier-style high-rise goes up in this neighborhood. Now, this building is actually a code violation in most of America. You have the retail on the first floor with the living quarters above. In this case, an Italian restaurant. A woman named Mima and her husband Joe own it. They live right up above here. You would need variances. In some states, you'd actually need to get variance from the state in order to build this building. And it's incredible, hard to believe. Here's another view of it. Why would you not want that? Why wouldn't you want to build a building up to the edge of the sidewalk? And there are examples here I saw this morning. If you go over where the highway comes into the downtown, it was widened and the buildings were set back away from the street. Why? You're in a city. Why would you want all that space between the buildings and the street with no sidewalk? And it's a format that the Florida DOT is comfortable with, but it makes this almost impossible to build. Here's another example. And this is a street in Milwaukee where the street's 54 feet wide. And in 1951, the city decided to put a setback line so they could widen the street to 72 feet, to the magical 72 feet someday. So all the buildings on this street that runs for 3 miles were made non-conforming uses. So when the building that was here had to be torn down, it had a fire, then the new building had to be back here. And if you bought one of the buildings that's up on the street, it would flunk the title search when you tried to borrow money to repair it. And so all these buildings, just like rotten teeth, it'd be like you're not allowed to brush the teeth or floss them, and they all fall out after a while. And the city did it to itself with regulation. And this happens it's all over America, this condition exists. particularly in the 50s and 60s, these setbacks were put in place, degrading the very value of the city itself. And I'm not sure the public had any idea that this was going on. And now we've changed it. We've put those lines back up to the street, so where this new building is, there had been a building that had to be replaced. The developer was able to pull all of his permits and go with this building as of right, without any variances. He had all his permits in 3 weeks. And because of that, because of all the time saved, we didn't subsidize this building. The city of Milwaukee didn't pay anything. The building went in where it was supposed to go and filled in a blank spot on the street. And even in more suburban locations now, some business groups are starting to say, you know, we've noticed that retail that's in an urban format, a destination format, makes more money. So in this case, even though a lot of the other buildings down the street are set back previously, it's a sprawl location, they're trying to, as the buildings deteriorate, they're going to build the new ones up on the street. And here's another example. We had a really dumb regulation that required 7 parking spots on this lot. This lot was an empty lot for about 30 years. And you couldn't possibly develop it and it's only 75 feet deep. So how would you put 7 parking spots and still be able to make any money on the building? And so we changed the rules so that you could have them off-site within 750 feet. And immediately, the owner of the property was able to develop it and make money. And you really do have to make money in cities in order for them to be successful. The idea that failure is preferable because somehow it makes the city more of an object of pity or someplace that might get more state aid or federal aid. That is not a good strategy because the federal government's broke and the state governments are broke, so you don't want to ask them for too many favors. Here's an example. We scraped a shopping center, an enclosed mall shopping center that failed in an African-American neighborhood on the north side of Milwaukee. But we had a developer that understood that African Americans shop. And so he bought the site after it was cleared, and he talked to Walmart, and Walmart came in and agreed not only to put in their store, their store is the standard format, but also to build it on a street with sidewalks. It has an address. It's on Hope Avenue. And other stores next to it. So it's in an urban format. And it works really well. And Starbucks is even in this neighborhood. Starbucks has now figured out that African Americans drink coffee. It's an amazing revelation. This is our permitting process before we reformed it. And this is actually fairly typical across the country. Over the years, as each citizen complained about something, the city would change the rules. And they would add a new law, and then that would be the overlay. And so you ended up having more exceptions than rules. The exceptions were the rules. And it cost developers a lot of money. And everything was an exception, and everything had to go to the zoning board of appeals. And so development ground to a halt. So we changed that. This drawing is, it looks like propaganda, but it's actually pretty accurate. And now you can do things as of right. And what we did was we had a very open process with the public where we said, what do you love about the city? What are the places that you really care about? And what don't you like? And let's have the zoning code make urbanism, if that's what you want, and they did want it, because urbanism always wins visual preference surveys. And then we had the code basically legalize what the public loved. And we don't have a lot of complaints about it. After 2 years, people don't need variances. The Board of Zoning Appeals rarely meets. They used to meet constantly. And in this case, this is Toronto, where they've had a good urban code for a long time. Even McDonald's, if confronted with a code and they know that if they obey it, they're going to pull their permits and get what they want otherwise, will actually fit into the community. You don't always have to take their formatted building. But this is what's done instead all the time. This is what's sort of we've learned how to do now after 50 years. It's like recovering from a stroke, trying to change it. Because really the basic ingredients of planning and architecture go back thousands of years. They go back to the ancient Persians and Greeks, the Mayans, the Aztecs, basic rules. And we've sort of thrown out all those rules. In this case, you have the 72-foot arterial, huge, 160-foot deep parking lot. Buildings so insignificant they won't bear signage, so everything has to have a pylon. Used to be just gas stations had pylons. Now everything has a pylon. This is what isn't done anymore. This is Main Street. It's complex. It's complicated. It's a little messy. So they wanted to clean it up. And actually, in 1930, the executive branch of the federal government under Herbert Hoover, I'm not sure he knew what he was doing, but they signed an executive order which exalted Euclidean zoning or separate use zoning as a model, and then gradually over the decades, communities picked it up. It wasn't a mandate, but it was a model. And the separate use zoning made this illegal. This is Main Street. And Main Street that we all know and love in the places where we see it, with the sidewalk and the retail on the first floor, low-cost housing above before HUD invented it. No subsidies or anything, but they had low-cost housing. You could live in one of these apartments, you save a little bit of money, maybe move a block further away and get a duplex, and then eventually get your single-family house, all in the same neighborhood. And look at the variety of life. You can drive on the street, you can park, there's even enough room to double park. It's not legal, but you can do it. You can ride the bus, you can bike, walk, you can shop. There's a hardware store, there's a fish aquarium store, there's women's clothing store, it's kind of leather place, you know, a little. And then a liquor store, there's a tavern over here. You know, after you go to some of these places, you can go to confession. There's a Catholic church. You can do all this on the street. You know, you could write a novel about all the lives that intersect on the street, and yet it's illegal. This is what we do instead all the time. We spend all our money, over half the money that's spent on streets in America goes to this one form, the grade-separated high-speed highway. This is the first section in Wisconsin back in 1958 that's Miss Concrete on the left and Miss Blacktop on the right. And that was the beginning of balanced transportation as we know it in the United States, half asphalt and half concrete. And this is what we created. It's all cleaned up. There's no mess. We cleaned it up, simplified it, made everything simple. The only purpose of the street now is to move traffic. No Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, no Ring Lardner stories about traveling with the Babe Ruth and all that stuff. No stories about anything, just this. And it has only one purpose. There's a distress lane, and you can't use it unless you're distressed. And you can't go on to the green stuff if you're really distressed. You can't go, this is all government, and if it congests, you're stuck. This is where you are. The blocks are far apart, miles apart. And it's in the big cities, it's so unpleasant to be near these things. They're very noisy. They concentrate all the traffic in one spot, creating flooding or congestion, as we would call it. And so you get these sound barriers. And the sound barriers that work the best are corrugated concrete, preset steel reinforced concrete panels, which are the only surviving technology of the former East Germany. You can see the prototype here. And in Berlin, they're all gone. The wall's gone. There's a few little spots where they've kept it just so that you can see what it looked like. But if Erich Honecker and Walter Ulbricht, the former leaders of East Germany, came back to life in Berlin, they'd be totally disoriented. But they could come to most of the major American cities and feel right at home. This is Potsdamer Platz the day before and after the wall came down. This was the main intersection in Berlin. In fact, it was the first intersection in Europe that had a traffic signal back in 1923. And this is the way it looks today. It's totally, it's like Times Square. And this is the main intersection in Milwaukee and most major American cities. And this intersection see, in Europe, they didn't build the freeways in the cities. They build them between cities or in a ring around the outside, but they never build them in the middle of the cities because the mathematics don't work. You create more congestion than you resolve when you do this. In fact, there's a mathematician, Dietrich Bryce. You can look him up on Google, B-R-A-E-S-S. And he, back in 1970, did something called Bryce's paradox, which shows you that if you add lanes in large cities, you'll create more congestion. Well, anyway, this one, to rebuild it will cost over $900 million for one interchange. I mean, that's still a lot of money, $900 million. And Pensacola gets to help pay for it. Just think of that. Now, this was the African-American community in Milwaukee in 1956. The main drag, the place where the Regal Theater and the Flame nightclub, and when Duke Ellington was done playing downtown, he'd play after hours here. Anyway, this is the way it looked after it was improved by DOT. And this was the nearby commercial district, which the freeway ran right next to, and which decayed. It didn't get eliminated, but the retail moved to here, the shopping mall, which is now tired and worn out. But, you know, was that an advance? Did civilization move forward when it went from this to this? All those boxes, they last about 20 years, and then they're gone. Some of these buildings, even in its decay, they're still around. They can be reused. This is the Marquette Interchange, the big intersection that we saw before. This is the way it looks underneath. Would you hang out there? You know, is that the kind of place you'd want to be? But we spend all our money on this. I mean, you have it in your own. You have that thing coming from I-110 coming into your community. It didn't add value to your community. It reduced the real estate values of everything near it. And, you know, I don't know what the hurry was anyway, but, you know, think about it. And the car industry knows this stuff doesn't work to sell cars. So they don't do ads in this kind of environment. They go to urban or rural, one or the other. This is a Subaru on a rock. And here's a Tahoe in the forest. And I don't know how it got there, but this is the image in your head as you go into the showroom with that song by Bob Seger, Like a Rock. And it's not about the congestion you're going to find or anything. It's this image. Or this Ford Explorer on a waterfall. Must have really good tires. Or this Buffalo feature. Or in this case, they had to go to Prague for this Infinity ad. And, you know, in Prague, that's the Charles Bridge in the background. And the Charles Bridge doesn't meet Federal Highway Administration standards. In fact, none of the bridges in Prague meet Federal Highway Administration standards. And you know what? Prague is doing okay without that. It's the richest city in the old Warsaw Pact bloc. It now has second, on continent of Europe, it's second in tourism to Paris. It is absolutely a jewel box. It's a place everybody wants to go. Big Fortune 500 companies have their headquarters there, and the streets are very narrow. In fact, there's sort of a rule. The narrower the streets, the higher the value of the real estate. And that, you know, there's times when that might not work, but you know, you think about it, shouldn't all this money we're spending on infrastructure add value? Why should it subtract value? Now, this was a freeway that was built in Milwaukee back in the mid-60s, and it's now gone. But look at the land uses that it had. A lot parking, decaying buildings, and parking. That's what developed around the freeway. In this case, you could park your car with a view of the river. And it'll be replaced with this. And we know this will work because just upriver, we went through the same process. We had 27 acres, which now has over $450 million of development. This is just starting now. But people want the urban form. They want to live in places that are well designed, where buildings actually relate to each other instead of being in isolation. This is the freeway as it crossed the major river in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee River. You couldn't see the river from the bridge, and the road was a curvilinear road, whereas the city is built on a grid. So you were disoriented both from the built environment and the natural environment. Here's another view of it, and then it starts coming down. This was sort of the last battle here, the War of the Worlds. And then it was gone. And it'll be replaced with, this is a view of it. Anyway, all the infrastructure is set and the development will start this month. Now this is nature's gift to us, you know, the stream with wetland. And the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, with a little bit of, you know, pushing back and forth still, but they basically, they and the other agencies have started to really figure out that you really don't need to do a lot to improve this. You can just leave it alone. The best thing is to just not spend taxpayers' money and kind of get back from it a little bit. In Milwaukee, they spent over, in today's dollars, they spent over $500 million channelizing these streams, which just speeds up the water and causes more flooding downstream. In this case, you know, imagine Claude Monet with his palette of paints, you know, in this picture. And, you know, wetlands are quite remarkable. This one's in Morocco. I didn't even know they had any water there. But, and now, anyway, we're taking those concrete things out and putting nature back in charge. Now this is, I make this analogy, this is the street grid, this is L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C. And see the redundancy? I mean, if one street doesn't work, if it congests, you go to the other. It's the matrix that works for traffic in an urban setting. Just like your matrix here in Pensacola can handle a lot more traffic than if you go out by the airport. If one road congests there, where do you go? There's really not an alternative. And so now, traffic engineers are just starting to discover what the water engineers already know, is that there's a value in this, and you don't want to screw it up. You want to save it. This is the model that they use now, and this is the model that gave you your what's that street that's next to the water out here? All right, you know it. Bayfront. Bayfront, okay. I mean, this model is what gave you Bayfront, you know, the Bayfront widening. It's a very dumbed down model. It just takes everything down to its bare essentials. It cleans everything up. There's no complexity anymore. You have the freeway, the arterial road, this collector road, the service road, and then everything else. All the avenues, the boulevards, all the things where there's a lot of real estate value, that's an afterthought. Because all that matters is just moving the traffic. And what happens under this kind of system is that you just have people traveling further and further between increasingly insignificant destinations. That's what it does. It reduces real estate value. If you don't believe me, just look at Detroit compared to Chicago. Detroit built every freeway anybody ever dreamed of. The road builders got everything they ever wanted and more. And they did it, and Detroit is hollowed out. Property values went way down, and they have no tourism other than their sports teams and casinos, but all the charm of the city was basically sucked out. In Chicago, they didn't. They had a strong neighborhood movement. They stopped a lot of the stuff. They kept their transit system, and it's a very wealthy city. I mean, billionaires live in Chicago. It's a very wealthy place. It has some poverty here and there, but even if you're in poverty in Chicago, you're a short L ride away from the Chicago Board of Trade, where there's hundreds of millions of dollars trading every day. So they dumb it all down. And they tell you that it has to be this way because their studies, their models say it has to be this way. And the public process is usually, it has two steps: too soon to tell and too late to change it. And so you never really get to, you get this frustrated feeling like, well, I guess I don't know enough to have an opinion. Here's Detroit. This is the way it looks now. And it used to have the Woodward plan. You know, if you'd seen a map of Detroit, I apologize for not having it on here. I didn't get it on this thing. But the beautiful street grid of Detroit, it's just fabulous. They had a plan called the Gradio plan downtown, and then the Woodward plan of radiating streets and a grid going across it. And tremendous real estate value. The most successful city in America at the end of World War II, the most productive city during the war, with sort of a rival with Los Angeles. And then, 30 years later, it's devastated. And you think about it, and it's not, I think the decline has kind of stopped, and they have a mayor now, Kwame Kirkpatrick, who has a sense of what the problem was. And so they're starting to work on some stuff that might work. But, here it was. And you look at it, if somebody who didn't know much about world history, and you showed them Berlin, which was 80% destroyed, and Detroit, you say, where was the epicenter of the most destructive war in human history, World War II? And they'd say, well, it must have been Detroit. Because Detroit is hollow, it has, entire neighborhoods gone, pheasant growing in the ruins. Now this is Milwaukee in 1950, and the black things are buildings. Particularly look at this part right here. There's entire streets. This was an important commercial street. Just watch what happens to it. This is 47 years later. And that's the freeway that we're tearing down. And that'll all be infilled again. But, before, after, did that improve? Is that an improvement? And here's the landscape in 1950, and here's the way it looked, and it's much more so now, 1995. I'm just going to rush through this because it's, this is an example of what you can do to a street, like Jacksonville could do this, where they can urbanize a street that they've have their suburban style office park and they can turn it into a real city. But I want to skip ahead because this is more relevant to Pensacola. Here we're back on that street that we were talking about before, the Main Street. And remember I said this 72-foot street is the model now, the most likely arterial commercial street to be built on new greenfield. This is the model of the most likely street to be built in America in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century. This street was built out in about 1885 or 1890. It's Port Washington, Wisconsin. And the engineers called it the two-rod street. 2 rods from the center lane to the building line with a 7.5-foot sidewalk usually. Those are the dimensions with the retail on the first floor. And if something added to this from the other one that I showed you is the Terminated Vista. So you have St. Mary's Catholic Church lining up perfectly with the yellow stripe in the road. And actually, this was probably taken from a pattern book. They probably didn't have a planner per se. They might have had some architects for some of the buildings, like particularly the church. But anyway, it's probably taken from a pattern book of Krakow, which was part of the Austrian Empire, because it looks very much like the main street in Krakow. The buildings aren't quite as big, but the same idea. Now, since World War II, until very recently, this street, this type of street, this typology was not built in America. A street with a variety of ownership, diversity of ownership, commercial buildings along the street with mixed use, with apartments above, and the terminated vista. A rare combination. Only until very recently, over that 50-year period, it only happened in 2 places. And I'll show you one of them, which is in Florida. All the elements are here. It's a little bit in miniature. But you have the retail on the first floor. Mickey and Minnie live right here. And then the Sleeping Beauty's castle terminating the vista. Now the elements of this picture go back to the ancients. The whole idea of having a street with ordinary buildings along each side of the street, and then the monumental building terminating the vista. All that was thrown out. Now, there was a reason. If you want to read a very readable book called From Bauhaus to Our House by Tom Wolfe. He's the guy that wrote Bonfires of the Vanities and all that stuff. But he describes how the architecture and art media of Europe at the end of World War I led to an obsession in the United States. We often distill what happens in Europe and turn it into something that is utopian and destructive in our own country. And they did that, this idea of rebelling against the past. And so they threw out the ornamentation of the past. And the modernists were so confident in themselves that it was like they had a computer and they pushed the delete button on everything in the past. They were so sure they were right. And in Europe, the modernists weren't quite as ascendant. So other things pushed back, and the built landscape was fairly entrenched. And so it basically just took its place as one of many art media. But in this case, in our country, at the end of World War II in particular, we embraced it and just deleted all this stuff. You couldn't do it anymore. But Disney understood that in order to attract tourists, building a strip mall wasn't going to do it. And so he took all the elements, the traditional classical elements of a commercial street, reproduced it in Disney World and Disneyland, and then cashed in and made a lot of money. And it was a brilliant thing. And when you think about Disney, it wasn't just about his cartooning. It was his ability to understand design. He really was a town builder. And you can see other examples. This is Cedarburg, not far from Port Washington. This also was built out in the 1880s and 90s. Imagine the sophistication it took to build this street and build it in a way where the buildings pay attention to each other. Each building isn't saying, look at me, I'm special, I'm better than the others. No, they work together. And the church at the end of the street terminates the vista, creating this wonderful space. Now, the Wisconsin DOT wanted to knock all the buildings down on the left-hand side to turn it into a 72-foot street. This is a 50-foot street, just like the other ones. It's remarkable. You go throughout the Midwest, they're all 50-foot streets because that was the format that worked. And here's an example of a terminated vista in pen and ink. This is a drawing of an Italian hill city in the Piedmont, the Campanile or bell tower terminating the vista, the ordinary buildings on each side. I'm not saying, I'm just bringing up terminated vista because it's a real easy one to visualize. But there are all kinds of little architectural techniques and tricks and so forth that built up over thousands of years. And they pushed the delete button, and it just didn't happen anymore. And that's sprawl. Here's a terminated vista in Chicago. Any of you that have ever been there, if you stand on LaSalle Street and look down the street and see the Chicago Board of Trade, what a wonderful sight it is. And it makes the street. It's the same thing with, all over the world. But it's coming back. That's the good news. Now, this might seem a little banal. I don't want you to laugh too hard here. This Target store, the R and the G line up with the yellow stripe, ordinary buildings on each side, sidewalks, there's a Barnes and Noble, and there's a sporting goods store, and it all comes together. This is where retail's going. Here's in the same Gaithersburg, Maryland shopping center, the Kohl's department store. The H lines up perfectly with the center lane. Same concept. So the urban form coming back. That's why, and this is happening all over the country now, where they're building these what they call lifestyle centers or urban villages. You know, they come up with different names, whatever seems to work. And they're going around all over the country. And one of the fortunate things is that downtowns that were kind of hollowed out a little bit in the last 40 or 50 years, this is a tremendous opportunity because the retailers know it, that going into the older spots that already have the blocks and streets, that they can, if they can fit in, if they can find the spots to be, they can actually do better. The retailers will actually prefer it. They're open to being in urban locations again, and not to be nice, and not to commit acts of social justice. They want to do it to make money. That's what it's all about. And so there's an opportunity. So if you want to see your retail grow, now maybe you won't. You know, some people, some communities like Madison doesn't want to have any large volume retailers in its downtown, so they have a 20,000 foot cap, 20,000 square foot cap. Target wanted to be in downtown Madison. They even agreed to have a small little front entry and with the building volume in back on what had been a surface parking lot, a multiple story store. Target, but it even had multiple entrances. So it would have been a department store, basically. If you put Nordstrom's on it instead of Target, you know, maybe they would have wanted it. But they, you know, like I said earlier, the average American can't buy everything they need at Pottery Barn. So you need to think about this stuff. If you want to have some large volume retail, they'll behave now a lot more than they would have 10 years ago. Even Walmart is starting to build multiple story stores. And there's a lot of attempts made to try to make these things work better. But this is an example, Santana Row in San Jose, where there's a problem. And the reason the problem is they tried very hard. They have apartments. It works up to a certain point. But it's one developer doing the whole thing and one architect doing the whole thing. And it creates a monoculture even though they're trying to be urban. And that's the great thing about an old place like downtown Pensacola. You go through generations, centuries of buildings, you know, real estate transactions and all this, and it creates a very real place. And it's a great, great setting for all kinds of things, living, retail, because it is so genuinely urban. So here they are in San Jose with all their money from computers and everything, trying to figure out how to have this shopping street. But it probably really won't work until it's got some pigeons. It's got to have something, you know, that makes it a little more genuine. Now here's a Terminated Vista in Milwaukee. And here you have the least arrogant star architect in the world, Santiago Calatrava. Oh, did I just pull the plug?
No, you didn't.
Oh, you just pulled the plug. Okay. But Santiago Calatrava built this and lined it up with the center lane. He spent about 5 weeks walking all over the site before he even put his pen on paper. And he respected the other buildings, and he respected the setting that he was in. There are other architects on this street that are important. Like H.H. Richardson did this building that has these little turrets on it. He's a very important architect from the late 19th century. He built the post office building on Pennsylvania Avenue and was in Washington. Looks very much like this. But here you have the buildings lined up and the monumental building terminating the vista. And it's created real estate value. All the values of this street went up because of this. It added value instead of subtracting value. And a lot of these stuff, you know, everybody's obsessed with having a museum, a stadium, a bigger convention center, you know, all these things, like all that's going to solve your problems. But if the buildings are designed in a way where they degrade what's already there, it's not going to add value. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't do a stadium, you know, I mean, a good stadium like the one in San Francisco, whatever it's called, I forgot the name. Pac Bell, yeah, the name's, ew. But anyway, but God bless you, Pac Bell, you paid for the stadium. But anyway, that stadium is incorporated into the neighborhood it's in. It works. It adds to the real estate value. But it's so important to do that. And in Pensacola, you have the structure, the built landscape in place to build on. So again, I want to invite you to come if you feel like it, those of you that are really obsessed. If you really want to, you can buy my book. And I just want to close with this. The City Beautiful movement, which was Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted and many other great architects, at the last turn of the century, or in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were trying to stop what to them was a terrible embarrassment. The European cities had really cleaned themselves up in the mid-19th century, and American cities had dirt streets, sewers running down the middle, frontier shack-like buildings. And so the City Beautiful movement, motivated by trying to clean up America, was very idealistic, and they did a lot of great things. Eventually the movement petered out because of World War I. But it was very idealistic, and people had a real feeling for it. And it actually spread beyond the designers to the general public. And I think that most people are pretty dissatisfied with the kind of cartoon sprawl architecture and planning that has dominated the landscape, and they're trying to figure out how to do it. And every idea that comes along isn't necessarily the answer. You know, so you have to have some common sense in all this and kind of sift and winnow. But I think all of us would agree that we need to pay more attention to how things will look and how things work, how things feel. And if we do that, I think we can build communities that will add value to the lives of our children and grandchildren, which is a very important thing to do. Thank you.